In 1915, while the world watched the Armenian Genocide, another people were being erased from the earth. They had no country. They had no army. They spoke the oldest Christian language on the planet, Aramaic, the language of Christ himself. And they were killed by the hundreds of thousands, not as collateral damage, not as an accident of war, as a deliberate target. Their word for it was Seyfo, the sword. And almost no one today knows what that word means. The Assyrian Christians are one of the oldest continuous civilizations in human history. They traced their lineage directly to ancient Mesopotamia, what is now northern Iraq, southeastern Turkey, and northwestern Iran. By 1914, their population was scattered across 3 empires: Ottoman, Persian, and Russian, protected fully by none of them. They were farmers, craftsmen, priests. They built churches in villages that had carried Christian worship for over 1,700 years. When the First World War broke out, those villages became targets. What followed between 1914 and 1920 was the near total destruction of Assyrian life in the Middle East. 2/3 of their entire population gone. They called themselves Suryoye, or Aturaye, the people of the plain. The Assyrian Christians were not a single unified group. They were divided across several ancient denominations: the Church of the East, the Chaldean Catholics, the Syriac Orthodox. Different rites, different liturgies, but they shared one thing: a language most of the modern world had already forgotten: Aramaic. The same language spoken in the streets of Jerusalem 2,000 years ago still lived in their mouths, in their prayers, in the names they gave their children. Their political and spiritual leader was the Patriarch, a title that carried the weight of an entire civilization. By 1914, that role belonged to Mar Shimun the 19th Benyamin. He was in his 20s. He had inherited the position at 19. He was not a general, not a diplomat. He was a religious leader thrust into a geopolitical crisis he had no tools to navigate. Under the Ottoman millet system, religious minorities were granted limited autonomy. But that autonomy came with a specific vulnerability. It depended entirely on the goodwill of those in power. The Armenians had foreign advocates, European missionaries, American Presbyterian networks, Russian diplomatic interest. The Assyrians had none. They existed in the margins of every map, too far north to be fully Ottoman, too Christian to be protected under Persian law, too small for Russia to prioritize. When the Young Turks, the Committee of Union and Progress, seized control of the Ottoman government after 1908, Assyrian villages in the Hakkari Mountains and the Ormia Plain began to hear the same stories: Kurdish tribal raids, churches burned, priests taken from their homes and not returned. It was not yet genocide, but the architecture of something was being built, and the Assyrians, scattered and without a powerful advocate, were watching it happen with no one to call. On October 29th, 1914, the Ottoman Empire entered the First World War on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. For the Assyrians, this was not a distant political event. It was a sentence read out in a language they couldn't appeal. Ottoman authorities moved quickly to conscript men from minority communities or pressure them into auxiliary military roles. Assyrian men living near the Russian border were ordered to fight against Russian forces. That meant fighting against the only regional power that occasionally expressed interest in protecting them. Most refused. That refusal was recorded, and it was used against them. The Ottoman military's irregular forces, the Teşkilât-ı, or Special Organization, had already been deployed against Armenians in 1915. The same networks, the same Kurdish tribal leaders who had been armed and incentivized by Ottoman command, now turned their attention to Assyrian settlements in the Urmia plain and the mountain villages of Hakkari.
There was no single written extermination order. No document has been found, and likely none ever will be, commanding the destruction of the Assyrian people by name. This is the same pattern seen in the Armenian case. Orders moved through informal channels, through tribal incentives, through the deliberate withdrawal of Ottoman military protection from areas where everyone involved understood what would follow. In March 1918, Patriarch Mar Shimun XIX Benyamin traveled to meet the Kurdish chieftain Simko Shikak. He went under a flag of truce to negotiate the safety of his people. Simko invited him to a meeting, then had him shot. The Patriarch's body was thrown outside. His bodyguards were killed beside him. With their leader assassinated and surrounded on three sides, 70,000 Assyrian civilians had no one left to negotiate for them, and the killing accelerated. The Assyrians called it Seyfo, the sword. In the Urmia plain of northwestern Iran, Assyrian villages were encircled by irregular forces and tribal militias. Men were separated from their families. Women and children were driven into the countryside with nothing. Wells were poisoned. Churches were burned with people still inside. American Presbyterian missionaries, men and women who had lived in the region for years, wrote accounts of what they witnessed. Those letters still exist. They describe mass graves dug in fields where Assyrian families had farmed for generations. The British knew what was happening. General Lionel Dunsterville led a small British force into the region in the summer of 1918, not to protect the Assyrians, but to secure a strategic military position against Ottoman forces. When his troops arrived, they found a population in full collapse. Tens of thousands were already dead.
What followed was one of the most catastrophic refugee marches of the early 20th century. Approximately 70,000 Assyrian civilians fled south through mountain passes in the summer heat toward British lines in Mesopotamia. There was no food. There was almost no water. Kurdish forces attacked the edges of the column. The sick fell. The elderly fell. Children fell. By the time the survivors reached the British camp at Hamadan, they numbered fewer than half of those who had started. Between 1914 and 1920, an estimated 250,000 to 300,000 Assyrian Christians were killed. That figure represents roughly 2/3 of the entire Assyrian population of the region. An entire civilization, reduced to refugee camps and the memory of people who had nowhere left to go. And the world was not watching.
The First World War ended in November 1918. The peace settlements that followed were supposed to rebuild the world on fairer terms. They did not. The 1923 Treaty of Lausanne
established the boundaries of modern Turkey, and granted legal minority protections to Greeks, Armenians, and Jews within Turkish territory. The Assyrians were not mentioned. No homeland, no legal protections, no formal acknowledgement that anything had been done to them. They were placed in refugee camps in British Mandate Iraq, given promises of autonomy and land. Those promises were not kept. In August 1933, 15 years after the war, the newly independent Iraqi government carried out what became known as the Simile Massacre. Iraqi soldiers and armed Arab tribesmen killed between 600 and 3,000 Assyrian men across a series of coordinated village attacks in northern Iraq. British forces in the region did not intervene. The League of Nations condemned it. Nothing followed.
There is a particular footnote worth pausing on. Raphael Lemkin, the Polish Jewish lawyer who spent his career trying to give legal weight to what had been done to entire peoples, cited the Solemnly Massacre as one of the events that drove him to create the legal framework we now use. The word he coined was genocide. The Assyrians, in part, helped make that word necessary. Then, they were written out of the history that word was built to describe. Today, the Seyfo is formally recognized by Sweden, Armenia, the Netherlands, and a small number of other nations. It is absent from most school curricula. It does not appear in most documentary series about the First World War. It remains, in almost every measurable sense, buried.
The Assyrian people still exist. There are communities in Chicago, in Sydney, in Stockholm. People who still speak Aramaic, who still carry the names of villages that no longer appear on any map. What happened to them in 1915 was not an accident. It was a deliberate campaign against a people who had no powerful nation willing to say their name out loud. And when the war ended, the silence continued. Not enforced by guns, but by diplomatic indifference and the economics of which histories get told. History does not bury itself. Someone has to do the burying. The question worth sitting with is this: who decided the Assyrians weren't worth remembering? And why are we still living inside that decision?